In August 2000, just 3 months after winning the presidency, Vladimir Putin was enjoying the first peak of his political career. But a piece of terrible news from the Barents Sea would plunge the new president and the Russia he governed into a chilling, deep-sea crisis. The sinking of the K-141 Kursk nuclear submarine was the first major test of Putin's presidency. However, his slow reaction, his cavalier attitude in the early days of the incident, and his clumsy handling of the victims' families not only deeply disappointed those who had placed high hopes in him, but also led to the first and only significant drop in his approval ratings during his early years in power. For the Russian Navy, it was the darkest and most humiliating moment since the collapse of the Soviet Union. But in a bizarre twist of fate, this catastrophic humiliation and botched public relations effort would not destroy Putin. Instead, it would paradoxically provide him with the perfect pretext to declare war on the Russian oligarchs who controlled the media. In the first half of 2000, Russia was in a state of disrepair, but was filled with a sense of hope for a new century and a new life. Vladimir Putin, then acting president, was riding a wave of immense political capital from the victory in the Second Chechen War. In the eyes of the Russian people, the humiliating and chaotic 1990s were finally over. A new, hopeful era was dawning. The presidential election on March 26 was less an election and more a coronation for the new Tsar, Putin. He won easily in the first round with over 52% of the vote. This overwhelming public support not only gave Putin an incredibly stable foundation for his rule, but also filled him with confidence. At his official inauguration on May 7th, he made a series of solemn promises to the Russian people to restore state order, rebuild a vertical power structure, and reassert Russia's status as a great power. Unlike in Western elections today, Putin's popularity didn't begin to wane after his victory. In the following months, his approval rating remained high, consistently above 70%. The vision of a Russian national revival seemed within reach. Against this backdrop, the Kremlin naturally needed a grand performance to announce Russia's powerful return. In August 2000, the Russian Northern Fleet assembled in the Barents Sea for the largest naval exercise since the collapse of the Soviet Union. The core purpose was to show the world that its once globally influential navy was being restored to its former glory under Putin's leadership. The star of this exercise, the K-141 Kursk nuclear submarine, was the ultimate symbol of this naval renaissance, one of the most modern and powerful vessels in the Russian fleet. But just as everyone was lost in the illusion of a resurgent imperial navy, a disaster struck without warning in the cold waters of the Barents Sea.
August 12, 2000 was a key day for the exercise. The Kursk's mission was straightforward. At around 11:30 a.m., it was scheduled to fire a practice torpedo at a Kirov-class cruiser. For the Kursk, this was a routine task. However, when the scheduled time passed, the exercise command received no signal of a successful launch, nor did they receive any routine communications from the submarine. Because it wasn't a critical part of the exercise, and there were many other ships to coordinate with, this minor loss of contact didn't initially raise alarms at the highest levels. The prevailing assumption was a common communication failure, or that the sub had gone silent to evade detection. The only ones who noticed something was wrong were at a Norwegian seismic monitoring station, hundreds of kilometers away. That morning, they recorded 2 powerful explosions from the seabed. The first occurred at 11:28 a.m. local time. 2 minutes and 15 seconds later, a much larger explosion followed. But the Norwegian station was a civilian agency. They knew there had been explosions, but they had no idea what had exploded and thus couldn't immediately inform the Russian government. It wasn't until that afternoon, after the Kursk had missed all of its scheduled communication windows, that the Northern Fleet Command began to realize something was terribly wrong. That night, a massive search and rescue operation was launched. The next morning, search vessels found the hull of the Kursk on the seabed, 108 meters deep, with clear signs of damage. As naval experts, the commanders of the Northern Fleet knew that when a submarine explodes on the seabed, the chances of survival for both the vessel and the crew are virtually zero. But they couldn't bear the consequences of losing either. They nervously sent a report to the Kremlin. At that moment, Putin was thousands of kilometers away, vacationing on the Black Sea coast, completely unaware that a media firestorm was about to engulf him. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster, the newly inaugurated president was in Sochi, enjoying his presidential vacation. According to the Kremlin's later statements, then Defense Minister Igor Sergeyev did inform him on August 12 that the submarine was missing. But the initial report was overly optimistic, suggesting it was just a technical malfunction that the submarine could resolve on its own. This report convinced Putin to stay in Sochi. And so, for the next 4 days, a bizarre scene unfolded. The entire nation's attention was fixed on the catastrophic rescue operation in the Barents Sea, yet the head of state had vanished from public view. The Russian people couldn't understand why, in the face of such a major national tragedy, with 118 sailors presumed dead, Putin didn't immediately return to Moscow to lead the rescue effort. The issue was twofold. On one hand, the Northern Fleet Command was trying to bury its head in the sand, hoping that by not alarming Putin, they could avoid being held responsible later.
On the other hand, the Russian media was firmly controlled by a few oligarchs hostile to Putin. Having gathered the most information, they had no intention of using it to help the Kremlin. Their only goal was to use the crisis to attack Putin. Television stations began broadcasting endless footage of grief-stricken families, stoking public emotion. They then heavily promoted authors from Norway and the UK to provide advanced rescue equipment, portraying the Russian military's refusal of foreign aid on national security grounds as a callous decision that disregarded the lives of the sailors. And then they looped footage of Putin on vacation, asking, "Where is the president?" By the time Putin returned to the Kremlin 4 days later, he found the situation had spiraled out of control. He was now facing a full-blown media firestorm. Fueled by the media, public grief had transformed into a tidal wave of fury at the Putin government's incompetence and indifference. Putin's initial public relations response fully exposed his early weakness in handling a crisis. On August 22nd, he traveled to the Northern Fleet's base in Vinyayevo for a closed-door meeting with the submariners' families. But instead of focusing on consoling them and making promises about the rescue and compensation, he spent a great deal of time in harsh language accusing the oligarchs, led by Boris Berezovsky, of exploiting the tragedy to undermine the state and the military. The grieving families were in no mood to listen to Putin's analysis of the political dynamics. The meeting descended into a chaos of tears and shouting. Putin's harsh words were leaked to the media, further cementing his image as a cold and ruthless leader. But this PR crisis didn't destroy Putin. This is because, while he was inept with words, he was not actually ruthless. What the media didn't heavily report was that on the very same day as that disastrous meeting, he announced a preliminary compensation plan in another setting, promising each family a payment equivalent to 10 years of their loved one's salary, plus additional housing and benefits. He also made a solemn promise to find every man, vowing to salvage the wreck of the Kursk and the bodies of the fallen sailors, no matter the cost. This wasn't just a stalling tactic. Putin's actions were swift and decisive. 4 days later, he signed a presidential decree awarding posthumous honors to the captain and all 117 crew members, and arranged for the payments to begin. At the same time, he defied conventional wisdom and insisted that the submarine's wreckage must be salvaged, launching an international tender for the job. Ultimately, the Putin government spent a staggering $130 million to successfully raise the wreck of the Kursk. They also managed to recover the remains of 115 of the fallen sailors from the Barents Sea floor. With the exception of those who perished at the epicenter of the explosion, Putin made good on nearly 100% of his promises to the families.
These swift and effective actions not only completely repaired his damaged credibility from the initial phase of the crisis, but also sent a clear message to Russian society. This new president might be bad with words, but he keeps his promises. By the end of 2001, Putin had fully emerged from the shadow of the Kursk crisis, and his public support had even surpassed its previous peaks. However, the proper handling of the Kursk aftermath was not the core reason for his enduring high approval ratings. For Putin, the greatest value of the Kursk disaster was that it provided him with the perfect political pretext to go after the oligarchs. The struggle with them and their eventual liquidation would be the most critical step in the consolidation of his power.